So depending on which book you have in front of you, the Mishnah might be recorded still as part of Mishnah 6, or it might already be recorded as part of Mishnah 7. It's just that certain versions divide the Mishnahs a little differently. Chapter 2, Mishnahs, I'm going to call it Mishnah 7, because that's probably the more common. Remember over here that we're talking about teachings of Hillel. And the last teaching we had of Hillel wasn't so much a teaching as much as a story. I mean, obviously it carried a very important teaching as we saw last week, but it was a story. Hillel's walking along and he finds this strange skull floating around, and he, starts having a conversation with the skull, as you do, right? As you do, it's the normal thing. You find a skull lying around, so you talk to it. And it turned out that the skull was the skull of somebody who had drowned people and was then drowned himself. And there were all the lessons that we learned from that. So what we move to now may seem to be quite unrelated to last week's theme. And at face value, perhaps it will appear to be unrelated. And we're not going to spend a lot of time making the connection, but just right at the beginning, I think it'd be valuable to link the two of them. So this week, the Mishnah that we're going to learn looks like it's a Mishnah that says, don't waste your time on things that are transient, rather spend your time on things that are valuable. And that would be true. That would be a great summary of this Mishnah. Don't invest your energy in things that are not going to give you lasting value, rather invest well. Now you can see kind of the carryover from last week, because last week we were talking about this individual who caused damage to other people and therefore was damaged. So you can kind of see the carryover from that. But once we start to go into the specific details, you'll see that obviously there's a lot more to the story that we're going to learn today. By way of introduction, before I share the Mishnah itself with you, by way of introduction, there's a magnificent insight from the Maharal of Prague. And the Maharal says, look, you have to understand, in a lot of Jewish literature, you will notice that the number 10 is a big deal. For example, of course, what's the most obvious? If you're going to talk about the number 10 in Judaism, what's the most obvious place where the number 10 is a big deal? It would have to be the 10 Commandments, Aseres Hadibros, the 10 Commandments. So you've got to ask yourself the question, why are there 10 Commandments? And people will tell you why they're 10 Commandments, because Hashem created the world using 10 utterances, as the Mishnah we're going to learn in somewhere down the line when we get there to chapter 5. So there it says, Ba'asara ma'amoros nivra ha'olam, that the world was created with 10 utterances. So there's a correlation, as the expression goes, Asara hakaf b'shekel hakodesh, that there are two things, each of which is a 10 utterances and 10 commandments. But shekel hakodesh, shekel comes from the word to weigh up. So they balance each other. They weigh up against each other. That doesn't answer the question necessarily, why 10? So the Maharal says, look, if you have a look, you'll notice that there are certain places in classic Jewish literature that speak about the concept of there being 10 levels between our physical world and the higher spiritual world. So that's what 10 represents. 10 represents the journey and the transition from the physical to the spiritual, from earth to heaven. Okay, so that's what the number 10 represents. The bridge between the physical and the spiritual, between the body and the soul. Obviously, if I'm going to talk about the physical world, obviously it relates to the body. And if I'm going to talk about the spiritual world, obviously that relates to the neshama. So for that reason, the Maharal says, if you have a look at the Mishnah that we're about to study together, you're going to notice that the Mishnah speaks about 5 things that are, so to speak, not worth investing in. 5 things that come with some kind of negativity associated with them. And 5 things that are associated with positivity. So in other words, he says you've got 5 things that are the domain, the reality of the human body, the physical experience, and 5 things that are associated with the neshama and the spiritual experience. And that's what Hillel wants to tell us. That the goal is, obviously, to focus on those lasting things. What are the lasting things? Things that belong to the neshama. So here's the Mishnah. Let's have a look at the Mishnah. So the Mishnah says, Hu haya oimer, that Hillel used to say, Marbe basar, marbe rima. You gotta love this Mishnah, by the way. When you read it, it's just like, doesn't it sound so incredibly encouraging? Marbe basar, marbe rima. What does that mean? Increasing human flesh just increases how much decomposes when a person passes away. Marbe nechosim, marbe daga. If a person increases possessions, all they do is they increase anxiety. Marbe, you're going to love this one especially. Marbe noshim, marbe chshofim. If a person increases their wives, they increase the likelihood of sorcery in their house. It's a little bit dangerous. I guess it's a good thing we're not doing this in person. A virtual shir is a lot safer for me to say something like that in a group of women, right? What does he say? If you have more wives, obviously you're going to have more sorcery in your house. Okay. No, that can definitely get you thinking. Then he says, marbe shvochos, marbe zimo. If a person has many maids, that will increase promiscuous behavior. Marbe avodim, marbe gozel. And if a person has many servants, that person can expect that there will be much theft. Maybe that's the easiest one for us to relate to. Anybody who's trying to manage a large staff will know the concept of shrinkage or pilferage. Right? We know that that's how it is. You're going to work with a lot of people. That's the problem that you're going to have. Okay, so what have we got? We've got a list of things over here. Flesh, possessions, wives, maids, and servants. Now, the Maharal says quite correctly, obviously, that if you talk about the world of the body, because that's where we're starting, we said that there are 5 things that relate to the world of the body and 5 things that relate to the world of the soul. So if you're going to start with the world of the body, what can you expect? You can expect that the nature of the physical, the nature of the body is that as you move, so you degrade. So he starts off talking about things that are especially close to a person, and then he starts to move further and further afield. Now, you might immediately say, whoa, hang on a second, what do you mean? He starts with things that are close, and then he moves further afield. He puts possessions before wives. Surely a spouse should be closer and should be a little bit earlier on the scale than possessions. So he explains the truth of the matter is that is the natural process. You know, there's what we call derech eretz. There's an appropriate way that a person is supposed to define and develop their life. And the appropriate way to do it is that before you settle down and marry, first you should establish yourself financially. So that's why the possessions come first. Then you build a family. Once you have a family, then you might have maids working in your house. And then if you really do well, you'll have servants who work in the fields. So that's how you see it moving further and further away from a person. So the first thing a person cares about obviously is themselves. Then a person establishes their possessions. Then they build a family, and then they extend the staff in their home. Now the key word over here in this part of the Mishnah, and equally in the next part of the Mishnah, even though the next part of the Mishnah, which we haven't read yet, talks about much more positive and meaningful things that are associated with the neshama, but he still uses the same word for both. And that's what's interesting. That sometimes what is absolutely toxic in one reality is absolutely beneficial in a different reality. So what's toxic about all of these things? What is it? Is there something wrong with basar? Is there something wrong with flesh? You got to have flesh. What do you mean? A person, in order to live, has to have a human body. Otherwise, you're not alive. It's that simple. So what's wrong with flesh? Nechasim, possessions. You have to have possessions. What you're not supposed to, and the Torah is very clear about this, that a person should not intentionally put themselves into a position where they have to rely on the community to support them. So you have to have nechasim. You have to have your own possessions, whatever that is. A home, a source of income, food on the table, clothing, etc. You have to. So what's wrong with that? What about marriage? Marriage, it's a mitzvah in the Torah. It's one of the most important mitzvahs. Pru Revu, the mitzvah of populating the earth, of perpetuating the species. The mitzvah of having a family, not just to have children, but the concept, the institution of the home, the institution of marriage. These are very, very holy things. Okay, you want to tell me maids and servants, that's already luxury? Fine. So what's the key word that tells us about how we're supposed to view this Mishnah? The key word is marbe. Marbe means to be excessive. As anybody will tell you, everything in moderation. Not everything in moderation. You can have whatever you want, do whatever in moderation. What's Hillel telling us over here? Marbe, that when a person wants more of what they should have than what they need, that's not a good thing. And he says straight away you can tell the distinction between the physical reality and the spiritual reality. In the physical reality, more and more always leads to trouble. More and more means more pressure, more difficulty, more challenge, more worry, etc. In the spiritual world, the second half of the Mishnah, marbe, always want more, because more and more will always bring you good. So for example, there's an expression that we use in our davening every single morning and every single evening. What do we say? We speak about Hashem when we say that Hashem is amazing, Hashem is great. Bashamayim mima'al ve'al ha'aretz mitochas. Hashem is in the heavens above and on the earth below, and ein oid, there's nothing else besides Hashem. So there's a saying based on that phrase. And the saying is, Bashamayim, when it comes to spiritual, heavenly things, Shamayim mima'al, you should always look at those who are above you, and you should always aspire, marbe, to have more and more of the world of Shamayim, more and more of the world of the Neshama, in order that you should be able to get to the level of those people. So you always want to add, and you always want to be excessive. Val ha'aretz, but when it comes to worldly, earthy, material things, mitochas, then you should always look at those people who have less than you have, and you should be grateful for what you have. That's the distinction that the Torah tells us between Yaakov and Esav. When Yaakov and Esav when they reunite after not having seen each other for decades, so what does Esav say? He says, "Vayomer achi yesh li rav." He says, "I have a lot." And Rashi says, "What does it mean, I have a lot?" Rashi says, he's an individual who can never be satisfied. So whatever he has, he says, I've got a lot and I want more. Marbe. I want a lot more. What does Yaakov say? Yaakov says, Yeshli kol. I have everything that I need. I don't require anything further. I don't live in the marbe headspace. Now this is Hillel speaking how long ago? Hillel, we're talking, what, 2,000 years ago? And then he was talking about the dangers of material excess. Could you imagine if Hillel would come into our world today? Marbe, marbe, marbe is like it's the camp song, it's the theme, it's the war cry of the 21st century. Marbe, I need more and I need more and I need more. So people have items that they don't require, and people indulge in things that nobody could have dreamed of even not so long ago. I was thinking about it yesterday, actually. Thinking about just in one particular example, entertainment. I was thinking about it. Since the advent of the internet, the notion of entertainment is that people expect that they will be entertained whenever they want, any time of the day or night, for any length of time that they choose. Think about that for a second. Not so long ago, what, call it 25 years ago, that was not an option. Wasn't an option. I'm just going to have it entertainment on demand. Even if for South Africans who always used to hear from the people in America about cable TV and all the different channels, and we were sitting over here with like SABC1, so it was like, wow, you have so much entertainment. But even then, you have to be in front of the TV. You have to be outside of working hours. In today's world, marbe. I just want more and more and more. When I want it, I click on a button, should be delivered. What's going on? How come it hasn't arrived at my house? So that's what Hillel's talking about. Marbe is always going to, if it's marbe about material things, if we want more and more and more of what the physical world has to offer, it's always going to come with some kind of sting in the tail. So let's go through each of the things that he says. The first one that he says is marbe basar, a lot of flesh. Now, you've got to be really careful in today's world because every class of people is somehow a potentially discriminated against category, and you're not allowed to say anything about them. And if you do say something about them, then there might be some rights organization that will take you to task over it. Marbe basar sounds like he's got a criticism of people who are overweight. Marbe basar. Now, you're not allowed to say that today. Right? In today's world, you've got to be very kind and fun. So Hillel would be in a lot of trouble, right? Marbe basar, for saying that people who have a lot of flesh, all it means is you're going to have a lot of, God forbid, rot in the grave. So that's not what he means. The Maharal continues, he says, basar, flesh, does not only mean the actual flesh on the human being, but it means anything that gives pleasure to the flesh. Marbe basar, marbe rima. The nature of our life, whether we're willing to admit it or not, is that all of those things that give us pleasure in the now, all of them rot. That means to say that every kind of an experience that we have reaches a maximum point, and after that maximum point, it no longer adds value. In fact, on the contrary, it starts to become disgusting. So let's say, for example, somebody had to say, I love cheesecake. Okay, you love cheesecake. In that case, we're going to bring you a cheesecake. So a whole lot of people come over to, let's just say for argument's sake, it's the person's birthday. So a whole lot of people come over, and what do they all bring? Cheesecake. No matter how much you love it, there's a limit to how much you could eat. And you reach a certain point where it becomes rima. It actually becomes disgusting. It actually starts to, so to speak, eat itself. In other words, it starts to become what was earlier such a pleasurable, enjoyable experience, now starts to become such a painful experience. I can't look at this stuff. So that's what he's telling us. Marbe basar, marbe rima. Anything that is an investment just in the material world has no lasting value. It will, so to speak, rot. It will expire. It will pass its sell-by date. And then actually it just becomes a pain in the neck. Along exactly those lines, this concept of marbe basar, marbe rima, it's not a comfortable conversation, let's be honest. To talk about the fact that whatever investment a person makes in the human body, the pleasures of the human body, what's it all going to amount to? Rima. That one day that body gets buried in the ground and then it decomposes, which is not a very pleasant conversation to have. But it's an interesting conversation. And the reason it's an interesting conversation is because Hashem designed us that we have to have a body. And nobody should for 1 minute imagine that there's something negative or bad about the body. It's a vehicle. You can't do a mitzvah without a body. That's why angels can shout and scream about how disappointed they are in the choices of human beings. They can, and they have throughout the course of history. But they can't do a single mitzvah because they don't have a body. And the shamas of the greatest tzaddikim who lived in the past have a certain envy for us who still have a body because we're able to perform a mitzvah. And that's why when you go to a cemetery, for example, you hide your mitzvahs. People who wear their tzitzis out, you tuck your tzitzis in when you go to the cemetery because you don't want to gloat in front of those who can't now do a mitzvah. So the body's not a bad thing. That's why it says marbe basar. It's when a person makes the body an excessive part of his life. That's the issue. And so the principle goes like this. We all know very well that there are interesting and sometimes a little eerie stories of individuals through the course of history, including in modern history, where for whatever reason it was, they had to exhume them years after they had passed away, and people were shocked to discover that their bodies were absolutely intact. Some of those include stories that we know of personally, not just stories we read about in books. So how could that be? Marbe basar, marbe rima. The only reason why the body eventually decomposes is because during the course of a lifetime, we fill our body with things that are debased. And that does not mean that they're against the Torah. It just simply means that they are fundamentally immersed in materialism. For example, the average person, when the average person eats food, That food goes into the system, and of course it's absorbed. The nutrients are absorbed into your bloodstream and into your flesh. That becomes you. So the average person eats why? To enjoy themselves. It's good, feels good, it's nice, it's pleasurable. Marbe basar. So eventually when a person leaves this world, in order to free the neshama, to have the full experience of the next world, that body that was so materialistic has to disappear. So marbe basar marbe rima, that's the message. If a person's engagement with the body is a lot of bodily focus, a lot of bodily pleasure, then eventually that so-called lowly part of the flesh has to eventually disappear to release the neshama to move higher. Then he continues, marbe nechosim, marbe daiga. If a person has many possessions, the person can expect that they will have many fears, many worries, many concerns. It's like the story that they tell about a guy who was very depressed. And he went to different people to assist him. And they told him, listen, the only way that you'll pull yourself out of this depression is if you could wear the shirt of a person who has no worries at all. Just by osmosis, you'd kind of you'd absorb some of their positivity, some of their goodness. So that's what you got to do. You got to wear the shirt of somebody who has no worries at all. Anyhow, this person came from the royal family. He had access to all kinds of people. So he sent out his scouts all over the place to find somebody who had no worries at all and get a shirt from them. Strangely enough, in the higher end of society, they couldn't find anybody. Everybody in the wealthy world is anxious. Think about it. Is it true? It's true. For us who live in the lap of luxury, even though we may not consider ourselves wealthy, if you think for 1 second, if you would bring your great-grandparents into your home, they'd be blown away. They think you live in a palace. So the more possessions a person has, the more anxiety. Why? Because you're worried, what if something breaks? What if something gets stolen? What if because I have the possessions, therefore I become a target, God forbid, for a criminal? You know how it is. We live in Johannesburg, you don't have to explain this. So marbe nechosim marbe daiga. Anyhow, the scouts, they went, and eventually they found a man who was the most happy-go-lucky, calm, tranquil person they'd ever met in their lives. And he was homeless. And he was homeless man, but he had this incredible attitude towards life. And they figured, bingo, this is the guy. He has no worries. We've got to get his shirt. So they go to him, they say, listen, we represent this very prominent individual and he's depressed. And they tell the whole story. Please, we'll pay you whatever you want. Please, can we have your shirt in order, to help this guy out? He says, I would help you with absolute pleasure. The only problem is I don't own a shirt. That's the point, right? Why? What's the point of the story, whether it's a true story or just a legend? The point of the story is that the minute you own things, there is some kind of daiga, there's some kind of worry. What if there's a storm? What if there's load shedding? What if there's this? What if there's that? So effectively, that's what he's telling us, right? He's telling us that a person has to understand that the nature of the things that we own, if we focus on them just simply because of their material value, we'll always have some level of anxiety. So what's that telling us? Is it telling us that we should all go live in a cave? Is it telling us that go have a yard sale now and get rid of everything because that's the source of all your anxiety, by the way? This wonderful home that you've built over who knows how many years, all those beautiful things that you have, that's the problem. Go get rid of it all. Scale down to one outfit. Move into a one-room apartment. Ready? Is that what he's telling us? How could it be telling us that? The Torah says very clearly that there are physical brachas that we get in our lives. That's how Torah works. Hashem promises us that good things will happen. We'll have good things. How does the Torah say it? If you listen to the mitzvahs, then I'll give you all the brachas. There are two ways to look at material possessions. One way to look at material possessions is I need to accumulate stuff. Because stuff will make my life easier and stuff will make me happy. Says Hillel, let me explain this to you. Stuff will never make you happy. If anything, the opposite. Stuff will make you stressed. However, if a person realizes that the reason I live in this world is to do what Hashem wants, to serve Hashem, to achieve Torah mitzvahs, therefore I have possessions, because those possessions are a conduit. They allow me the opportunity to serve Hashem. If I have a nice house, I can entertain people for a Shabbos, and I can have people over to sleep because I've got a guest room. Or people will want to have a shir in my house because I've got a nice dining room table that can accommodate a bunch of people. Then you won't have anxiety. I tell a story about a chassid. I can't remember offhand which chassid it was. I tell a story that he had a very beautiful home. I think it might have been Rabbi Binyamin Kretzker. I stand to be corrected. A big chassid follower of the Alter Rebbe, the first Chabad Rebbe. He had a beautiful, beautiful home. And this was a time where chassidim generally did everything in their power not to invest themselves in materialism. So the chassidim, who were his colleagues, were a little bit critical of the fact that he had such a beautiful home. Where does this come from? How does it get into your head? So he said, let me explain to you. I'll explain to you how it works. If I have the most beautiful home in the shtetl, then when the council of the shtetl wants to meet, they're going to want to meet in my home because it's got the most beautiful dining room table and it gives prestige to the council of the community. So that's where they're going to want to be. If they're going to host their communal meetings in my house, they're going to have no choice but to include me in the council, because why else would I allow them to do that? To use my house. If they allow me to be on the council, then I'm going to have an opinion. So when the community council comes to vote on the salary that they should give to Yankel the Melamed, who teaches all of our children at school, I can fight for Yankel to get a good salary because the council's in my house. So why do I have this beautiful house and the beautiful dining room? To be able to help another Yid that he should get the salary that he needs in order to survive. If a person focuses just on having material things, lots of anxiety. In fact, some of the Mefarshim say that what does it mean lots of anxiety? When a person has all kinds of diversified wealth, so you're worried, what about this market? What about that thing? There's so many factors. But there's this beautiful talk that the Rebbe gave. Mar ben Nechasim says the opposite. If the purpose of having your Nechasim, of having all of your possessions, is to be able to serve Hashem, then Hashem gives you more of those possessions and without the anxiety. Okay, so we've dealt so far with the two that are probably relatable. Of course, if you invest in materialism, you stand to lose the most after this life because your whole life was about the physical. So when that goes, what do you have? And obviously, we can all relate to the idea that if a person has many, many, many possessions, then it's going to cause them many areas of stress. But the next one is possibly just a little bit uncomfortable for people, especially for this crowd. Marbe noshim marbe kshofim. That if a person has many wives, they're going to have much sorcery in their home. Remember, of course, the Pirkei Avos is the part of the Torah that teaches us how to go lifnim mishuras hadin, beyond the requirement of the law. Because at this time in history, according to law, a person was allowed to have more than one wife. It's only later in history that the ban of Chenim D'Rabbeinu Gershom came into play and we stopped polygamy. Not that polygamy was necessarily so widely practiced, but that's conversation for another time. The point over here that Hillel is saying is, you are allowed to have more than one wife, but you shouldn't have more than one wife. Why? Kshafim. Because what's going to happen is, as many of the Mefarshim will say, if you have more than one wife, there's going to be jealousy in the home, and the one is going to try to voodoo the other one, and that's where the kshafim is going to come, right? Because each one is vying for prominence in the family, so they'll do whatever it takes to retain their position, even if that requires a little bit of black magic going down the road to the person who throws the bones, or whatever you got to do, anything to ensure their position within the family. Marbek shofim. Okay, so I don't know what you think of that. I don't know if it sits that comfortably for a person to say, look, the minute that women have a little bit of rivalry, they turn into witches. That's pretty much what it sounds like. I don't know that people will appreciate that particular view so much. So the Maharal says something that's interesting. He says, how does kshafim work? What is this concept of of black magic, sorcery, or voodoo, or whatever it is, everybody will acknowledge that it's not necessarily the most rational, tactile thing. Nobody can show you this is how it works. It's a little bit more out of the box. It's a little bit more imaginative and creative, for which reason many people don't believe in these things. I recently heard about somebody who has offered, over the last, whatever it is, 15 years or something, offered $1 million challenge to any person who could prove any paranormal concept that exists. He's still sitting with $1 million. So that's the point. Kshafim means things that are out of the box, things that you don't understand, things that are more creative and imaginative. So the Maharal says the nature of women is to be more creative. When it says kshafim over here, it doesn't necessarily mean that the minute there's more than one wife involved, that the one is going to immediately start doing things that belong to the occult in order to affect the other. What it means is that they will do things that are not necessarily rational and that are, so to speak, creative to protect their position within the family. That's his explanation. I came across a very interesting perspective, very interesting, and it flips it completely around. Because most people read this and say, as we've just done, marbe noshim, marbe chshafim. If there are many women in the mix, there is going to be much sorcery in the mix. Sounds like it's the women who are the sorcerers. Who says? Doesn't say that in the Mishnah necessarily. Maybe it means the exact opposite. Marbe noshim, if a man brings many women into his life, marbe chshafim, maybe he's going to bring out his own dark side. In other words, the first one said marbe basar marbe rimo, that a lot of flesh means a lot of rot. Who's that happening to? The person who has the flesh. He's the person who's going to rot. Marbe nechosim marbe daiga, many possessions, much anxiety. Who's going to have the anxiety? The person with the possessions. So by the same logic, marbe noshim marbe chshafim. If there are many women, who's going to have the kshafim, the so-called sorcery? The person who decided to have many women. So there's an insight that actually it's the kshafim inside of the person. There's something dark inside of this individual because they have allowed themselves to focus on the external, the physical. Why does a person want all these wives? We're not talking over here about Yaakov Avinu, who had the intention that he wanted to build the Jewish nation, and that's why he allowed himself to marry more than one wife. Or Avram Avinu, who married a second wife because he wanted to be able to establish a nation, and his own wife, Sarah, told him that he should take a second wife in order that he should be able to have children. We're not talking about that over here. Here we're talking about somebody who sees the world in very superficial terms and wants more wives because he wants to enjoy life more, he wants more beauty around him, or whatever his particular focus is. The word kshafim is a plural word. So if you take the word kshafim to its singular, the singular would be kishuf. Kishuf could be spelt, because not every word in Hebrew always has to have its yuds and its vavs. So kishuf could be spelled Chav, Shin, Pei. What's Chav, Shin, Pei? The Gemara in Ksubas tells us that the classic ways that women would beautify themselves in those days was with Koichel Eineha. Should put eyeshadow. That's the Chav. Chav stands for eyeshadow. Koichel Eineha. Then the second thing that a woman would do would she'd put like kind of rouge on her cheeks. That's called soireik poneha, that she would put this rouge on her face. And the last thing that she would do is that she would do pirkei sareha, which means she would plait her hair. So those are the three major things that a woman would do to attract, to make herself attractive. Eyeshadow, color on the face, and plaiting her hair. So the Gemara there talks about the possibility of a man appreciating his wife without needing all of that extra accessory. So even when she doesn't do her hair and she doesn't do her makeup, he appreciates her for who she is. Marbe noshim marbe kshafim. The person who's looking around at many women, wants many wives, That's a person, he's looking for much kshafim, the plural of those three words. He's looking for the external beauty. So to speak, his demons, in a sense, are almost coming out. And that's not an appropriate way. It's not an appropriate response to how a person should establish a family and how a person should establish a marriage. It should not be based on the external appearance. It should be based on virtue. So just as you have these three things that spell the word kishuf, which are all about external appearance, there are three things that spell the word chana that talk about virtue, the three special mitzvahs of a woman. Chala, nida, the laws of family purity, and hadlokas neiros, lighting Shabbos candles. Chala, you plait. So rather than to focus on the plaiting of the hair, which is an external show of beauty, you look for the virtue of plaiting the chala, which means to bring the spirit and the sense of kashrus and the sense of the value of what food is all about, that it's not just that we eat, but we eat with purpose and meaning, to bring that into the house. Just like one of the external means of beauty is this rouge, this kind of reddening of the face, so instead you look for the virtue of the laws of purity, the laws of family purity, which are obviously associated with red and with white. So you look for the purity of whiteness rather than the external, so to speak, beauty that is expressed with redness. And the eyeshadow, instead of looking for the external application of eyeshadow, you look for the personal virtue of adlokas neiros, a person who lights candles that illuminate the sight of the members of the family. So marbe noshim, marbe kshafim, actually Hillel is warning us that when a person approaches marriage, it's to look for those things which are meaningful in marriage, not for those things that are just attractive in marriage. And then the last two on the list of the body, obviously we're going to, just looking at the time, we're going to have to leave the second half of the Mishnah that speaks of the virtues of the neshama for next week, please God. So then the next two things he speaks about, marbe shvachos, marbe zima, marbe avodim, marbe gezel. So what happens when a person has many maidservants, or when a person has many slaves? Well, if you read the parasha this past Shabbos, you will know where maids and slaves come from. It was the curse that Noach gave to his son Cham after Cham misbehaved and mistreated him. Yes, Noach also did something that was inappropriate, and he had too much to drink, and as a result of that, he landed up lying totally exposed. But the way Cham dealt with it was completely inappropriate. Subject also for another conversation. Cham, I think, was the first person to ever share something on social media. Right? To ever share something. Oh, look at this. It's like completely newsworthy. Let's go tell everybody about it, rather than address it. So Cham was cursed, and more specifically, his fourth son, whose name was Canaan, was cursed. What was the curse? Vihi Canaan eved lomoy. Canaan would always be a slave. Eved avodim yele echov. He will be a slave of slaves to his brothers. So what do we see from that? That typically the people who end up being maidservants and slaves are typically from the family of Cham, and specifically the family of Canaan. What do we know about the people of Canaan, the family of Canaan? Much later on in the Torah, meaning to say much later than the story of Canaan's curse, we get told that Hashem tells Moshe, tell the Jewish people, you have to be a moral nation. Don't commit incest, don't commit adultery, don't engage in homosexuality, etc. Introducing that piece, the Torah says, don't behave like the Egyptians and the Canaanites. Cousins, Egyptians and the Canaanites, cousins who come from Cham. In other words, the nature of these people is that they are more likely to be predisposed to promiscuous behavior. Therefore, be aware, if you're going to bring many maidservants into your home, the nature of these people, being descendants of Canaan, is that they will naturally gravitate to promiscuous behavior. So the more of them you have around, the more likely it is there'll be promiscuity in your home. That is the shvachos, that's the maids. What about the avodim? What about the slaves, the servants who also come from Canaan? They've got the other trait of Canaan. Canaan has another trait besides lewd behavior, besides being promiscuous by nature. What's the other side of Canaan? So this is actually alluded to in the name. A Canaani is a wheeler dealer. That's what a Canaani is. In other words, somebody who engages in not so kosher financial dealings. And so the Canaanim, the slaves, the servants of Canaan, the men of Canaan, are predisposed to theft. We actually see this, by the way, from Lot. Remember the story with Avram and Lot, which is in this week's parasha, that they have to split ways because Avram was very, very careful that his shepherds should never take the flocks into pasture that didn't belong to them. And Lot's shepherds, they had it meant nothing for them. Whatever was most convenient, whatever was quickest, we make a quick buck. That's how we operate. Those are the servants of Canaan. So what do? They look for this. Why do I have to work so hard in order to earn? If I can pilfer something, it's a much quicker way for me to provide for my family. Marbe avodim, if you have many people who come from that world, from that mentality, and those are the individuals who are working within your home, you can expect many things to disappear and to go missing. So, in summary, what have we seen in the first half of the Mishnah? See, in the first half of the Mishnah, why would a person do any of these things? Pursue physical pleasures, want to have many possessions, want to have a bevy of women, want to have so many slaves. Why? That would all indicate a person whose life centers on the nature of their body. The first 5 elements of the human being, the natural physical part of the human being. And any one of those things is only going to bring with it some kind of loss and some kind of degradation. Please God, next week we'll look at the flip side. Well, what happens then if a person focuses on the neshama? What are the benefits of focusing on the neshama? That remains to be seen, as we say in the classics, to be continued, please God, next week.